The Philosophy of Symbolic Forms, Volume 2, Mythical Thought by Ernst Cassirer, quotes. The Philosophy of Symbolic Forms, Volume 2, Mythical Thought by Ernst Cassirer delves into the complex nature of mythical thinking, emphasizing its role as a fundamental mode of human perception and understanding. Cassirer presents myth as an original symbolic form that precedes and shapes language, art, and even scientific thought. By examining myth as a unique form of consciousness, Cassirer illustrates its power to construct and organize the world through symbolic meaning, establishing a framework in which the sacred and the profane coexist in shaping our perceptions of reality. This volume explores the dynamics of myth's influence on both the individual and society, emphasizing its intrinsic value and interconnectedness with other cultural forms. Quote 1. It is one of the first and essential insights of critical philosophy that objects are not given to consciousness in a rigid, finished state, nakedly in themselves, but that the relation of representation to the object presupposes an independent, spontaneous act of consciousness. The quote emphasizes that objects of perception are not simply presented to our consciousness fully formed. Rather, they are the result of a dynamic, constructive process by consciousness itself. This notion aligns with Kant's epistemological views, where understanding an object involves an active interpretation by the mind, rather than passive reception, suggesting that our grasp of the external world is fundamentally shaped by the cognitive structures within us. Quote 2. Every such worldview is possible only through specific acts of objectivization, the reshaping of mere impressions into intrinsically determinate and configured representations. This statement underlines that all worldviews are constructed through a cognitive process where raw sensory data, impressions, are transformed into meaningful units, representations. It implies that our understanding of the world is a creative and interpretative act, reinforcing the idea that knowledge is not merely about uncovering reality as it is, but actively constructing it through cognitive frameworks. Quote 3. Myth, too, lives in a world of pure figures, Gestalten, that confront it as something thoroughly objective. Indeed, as the objective, pure, and simple. This quote reflects on the nature of myth as engaging with representations, figures, that are perceived as wholly objective and real. It illustrates how mythic consciousness accepts these figures as the actual reality, without the critical, distinguishing processes typical of empirical or scientific thinking. This highlights a fundamental characteristic of mythical thinking, its acceptance of symbolic representations as direct reality. Quote 4. And with this one basic feature, Grundzug of mythical thinking, which has initially been only generally portrayed here, a wealth of other features are determined as its simple and necessary consequence. And with this, the special phenomenology of myth is already indicated in its broad outlines. This passage outlines how a core aspect of mythical thinking, the uncritical acceptance of symbols as reality, sets the stage for a broader range of characteristics inherent in this mode of thought. It suggests that understanding this foundational trait of myth can lead to a deeper appreciation of its complex phenomenology, which includes a less differentiated conception of reality and a lack of critical separation between various levels of existence. This approach to myth emphasizes its integrative rather than analytical nature. Quote 5. It is no mere show, Schaustück and spectacle Schauspiel, that the dancer who participates in a mythical drama performs. Rather, the dancer is the god, becomes the god. This quote discusses the profound identification experienced by participants in mythical dramas, such as dances or rites, where performers embody the divine figures they represent. In these rituals, the boundary between performer and deity blurs, suggesting that these enactments are not merely theatrical representations, but are lived experiences where participants genuinely become the gods they portray. This embodies the concept of performative reality in myth. where actions and roles in rituals are direct manifestations of spiritual truths and presences. Quote 6. This inability of mythical thinking to apprehend only according to signification, to apprehend a pure ideal and significative, is most pregnantly expressed in the position that language is given here. In this context, the quote highlights the integral role language plays in mythical thought, not merely as a communicative tool, but as a bearer of reality itself. Words and names in mythical contexts are not abstract symbols, but contain the essence and power of the things they describe. This perspective underscores a fundamental aspect of mythical consciousness, where the symbolic and the real are indistinguishably intertwined, giving language a creative and performative power in the shaping and maintenance of reality. Quote 7. The proper mythical magical force of language emerges, however, only where it appears in the form of an organized, articulated sound. Here, the quote delineates how the structure and organization of language enhance its power within mythical thought. Organized speech, especially names, not only represents, but actively participates in the reality it describes. This emphasizes the belief in the inherent power of words to affect the world directly, a concept prevalent in many traditional cultures, where spoken words, and especially names, are treated with reverence and attributed with the power to influence and alter reality. Quote 8. For original mythical thinking, however, the name is even more than such a skin. It expresses the inner, essential being of the person. Mensch, and is, literally, this interiority. This statement captures the profound significance of names in mythical thought, where a name encapsulates and embodies the essence of a being. In mythical cultures, names are not arbitrary labels, but are intrinsic to the identity and existence of a person or a deity. The idea that changing a name could alter one's destiny or essence illustrates the power attributed to names in shaping and defining reality. This belief in the conflation of name and essence highlights the non-dualistic nature of mythical thought, where linguistic and ontological categories are fluid and interconnected. Quote 9. The influence of this thought form can be followed in the direction of time as well as in the direction of space. It has reorganized after itself the apprehension of succession as well as that of simultaneity. This quote highlights the profound impact of mythical thinking on the perception of time and space, emphasizing how it reshapes conventional understandings of sequential and concurrent events. Mythical thought challenges the linear and analytical perspectives typical of scientific understanding, proposing instead a more integrated and holistic view where connections between events and objects transcend simple cause and effect relationships. This reorganization suggests a worldview where everything is interconnected in a complex web, defying straightforward categorization and separation. Quote 10. As we see, the sympathetic interconnection that is assumed between the individual parts of the body is totally indifferent to their physical and spatial separation. This statement explores the concept of sympathetic magic within mythical thought, where there is believed to be a profound and inextricable link between all parts of a living being, regardless of physical separation. This idea supports practices such as the preservation or destruction of hair and nails to protect against magical harm, reflecting a belief in an enduring connection that physical distance cannot sever. It underscores a fundamental aspect of mythical logic, where the essence of a person or object is not confined to its physical form, but extends to all its parts, no matter where they might end up. Quote 11. Any part of the body, however inorganic, such as the nail or the little toe, is equal to any other in what it magically signifies for the whole. Instead of the organic construction, which always presupposes an organic differentiation, a simple equivalence prevails. This quote discusses the mythical view of the human body, where every part, regardless of its typical physiological importance, holds equal magical significance. In mythical thinking, inorganic parts like nails are just as critical as organically active parts, like the heart or brain, in their symbolic and magical capacities. This perspective challenges modern anatomical and functional hierarchies within the body, suggesting a more democratized and holistic view of human physicality in the context of magical beliefs. Quote 12. Strange as this kind of causality may seem to us, it immediately becomes intelligible when we consider that here the arrow and the wound, the cause and the effect, are still an entirely simple, unanalyzed thing, unity. In this statement, the interconnectedness of cause and effect in mythical thinking is highlighted, especially in the context of sympathetic magic. The connection between an arrow and a wound it causes is seen not as two separate entities interacting, but as a single, undivided occurrence. This view contrasts sharply with the scientific approach, which would analyze the mechanics and sequence of the arrow causing the wound. Instead, mythical thought perceives them as inherently linked, with the arrow essentially being a part of the wound it creates, reflecting a non-dualistic understanding of events. Quote 13. The modes of connection that they both employ to give the form of unity to the sensible manifold, to imprint a shape, Gestalt, on the diffluent, disclose a thoroughgoing analogy and correspondence. This quote emphasizes the fundamental similarity in the way both mythical and scientific thinking attempt to organize and give form to the chaotic sensory inputs of the world around us. Although the methods and outcomes may differ, both approaches strive to create a coherent structure or shape from disparate elements, highlighting an underlying unity in human cognition that transcends the specific modalities of thought. Quote 14. Before the general theory of motion became pure mechanics, the mathematical presentation of the phenomena of motion, Bewegung, it had sought to answer the question of the where-from, woher, of motion, Bewegung, which took it back to the mythical problem of creation, to the problem of the prime mover, Beweger. This quote illustrates the historical progression of concepts from mythical to scientific understanding, using the example of motion. Initially, the explanation of motion was embedded in mythical narratives about creation and prime movers, which provided a foundational context. As scientific thought evolved, these concepts were transformed into mathematical and mechanical explanations, shifting from metaphysical to empirical inquiries. Quote 15. And no less than the concepts of space and time, the concept of number, before becoming a purely mathematical concept, was also a mythical concept, as a precondition that, if foreign to the primitive mythical consciousness, underlies all its further, higher formations. Here, the transformation of the concept of numbers from a mystical to a mathematical framework is discussed. Initially imbued with sacred significance, numbers were once revered for their mystical properties. Over time, this perspective shifted, allowing numbers to become tools of measurement and abstraction in mathematical theory, reflecting a significant shift in cognitive frameworks from the sacred to the secular. Quote 16. And yet, each of these concepts, as soon as we restore them to the mythical sphere, immediately take on a unique particularity and, as it were, a certain distinctive tonality. This statement explores how universal concepts, when placed back into a mythical context, acquire a unique interpretation and emotional resonance specific to that framework. It suggests that while the building blocks of thought may be similar across different cognitive systems, their applications and interpretations can vary greatly, leading to distinctly different worldviews and understandings of reality. Quote 17. The theoretical construction of the worldview arose at the point where consciousness first performed a clear separation between semblance and truth, between what is merely perceived or represented and true beings, Scienden, between the subjective and the objective. This quote describes the critical development in human consciousness when it began distinguishing between appearances and reality, between subjective experiences and objective truths. This differentiation marked a pivotal shift toward a more analytical and structured understanding of the world, enabling the development of scientific thought that seeks to discern the underlying truths of the natural world beyond mere sensory perceptions. Quote 18. The criterion for truth and objectivity employed here is the element of persistence, logical constancy, and logical lawfulness. This quote underlines the standards by which empirical scientific thought judges truth and objectivity. These criteria include the persistence of phenomena over time, their consistency, and their adherence to logical laws. This framework is foundational for scientific inquiry, which aims to identify reliable and universally applicable principles governing the physical world. Quote 19. As we have seen, such a separation and stratification is totally alien to mythical consciousness. This consciousness is and lives in the immediate impression, which it accepts without measuring it by something else. This quote contrasts the direct and unquestioning nature of mythical consciousness with the questioning, doubting nature of scientific thought. Mythical thinking embraces the immediacy of experience and the visceral impact of the perceptible world without seeking to parse its experiences through the lens of objective analysis or logical reasoning. Quote 20. However, this very intensity, this immediate forceful power with which the mythical object is there for consciousness, now raises forth from the mere series, which is always uniform and recurs identically. This statement highlights how the compelling force of mythical consciousness shapes its perception of objects not as mere elements of a repetitive series, but as unique, singular manifestations imbued with significant presence and essence. In mythical thinking, objects and events are perceived with an intensity that assigns them an irreplaceable position in the consciousness, reflecting a worldview where every element has a distinct and profound significance. Quote 21. To provisionally describe the particular nature of the mythical intuition of space and provide a general outline, we can begin from the observation that mythical space occupies a distinctive middle position between the space of sense perception and the space of pure cognition, that is, the space of geometrical intuition. This quote introduces the concept of mythical space as a unique form of spatial understanding that resides between our everyday sensory perception of space and the abstract, mathematical conception of space used in geometry. Mythical space integrates elements from both sensory experiences and intellectual abstractions, forming a hybrid that influences how mythical thought interprets the world. Quote 22. Euclidean space is indicated by the three basic attributes of continuity, infinity, and thoroughgoing uniformity. All these elements, however, contradict the character of sensible perception. This statement contrasts the theoretical attributes of Euclidean space, continuity, infinity, and uniformity, with the limitations of human sensory perception, which is inherently finite and non-uniform. This contrast highlights the gap between abstract mathematical concepts and the way humans actually experience space in the real world. Quote 23. If we begin from this standard of comparison, there would seem to be little doubt that mythical space is closely related to the space of perception and strictly opposed, on the other hand, to the thought space of geometry. This quote posits that mythical space is much more aligned with the sensory perceived space than with geometrically conceived space. It suggests that mythical thought processes, which incorporate perceptions and intuitions about space, are fundamentally different from the abstract, rule-based conceptions used in geometry. Quote 24. Thus, in sensible space, as in mythical space, no here and there is a mere here and there, a mere term for a general relation that can recur identically in the most diverse contents. Rather, every point, every element possesses here, as it were, a tonality of its own. This statement captures the essence of how mythical and perceptual spaces are experienced as filled with unique and specific qualities that are not reducible to abstract points. Unlike in mathematical space, where locations are neutral, in mythical and perceptual spaces, every location has a character and significance of its own, influenced by cultural, emotional, and sensory factors. Quote 25. The places and directions in space stand out from one another because and insofar as a different accent of significance is connected with them, because, and insofar as they are mythically evaluated in different and opposite senses. This quote explains that in mythical consciousness, spaces and directions acquire their distinct identities not through physical characteristics alone, but through the meanings and values assigned to them mythically. Each space or direction's significance is shaped by the cultural, spiritual, or religious importance it holds within a particular mythos, illustrating how human perception of space is deeply intertwined with cultural narratives and values. Quote 26. The unfolding of the mythical feeling of space always begins from the opposition of day and night, light and darkness. Here, the emphasis is on the fundamental role that the dichotomy of light and dark, day and night, plays in shaping the mythical understanding of the world. This elemental contrast influences not only the physical perception of space, but also the metaphysical and symbolic interpretations of events and entities within various cultures, reflecting a deep-seated human tendency to categorize and interpret the world through binaries. Quote 27. In this valuation, Wertung, a spontaneous act of the mythical religious consciousness is performed. However, objectively considered, it is also connected to a certain basic physical fact. This quote highlights that while the assignment of value to different aspects of space in mythology may seem arbitrary or purely cultural, it often has roots in tangible physical phenomena. For example, the way light interacts with the environment can influence how spaces are perceived and valued, bridging the gap between the physical world and its mythological interpretations. Quote 28. However, even where this difference and conflict do not present itself in this intellectual determination, in this almost dialectical intensification, it may be recognized as one of the latent motives in the religious construction of the cosmos. This statement points out that even when the contrast between light and dark is not explicitly articulated within a culture's mythological or religious narratives, it often underlies and shapes these systems as a fundamental, if latent, motif. This underscores how deeply embedded the light-dark dichotomy is in human cultural and religious frameworks, serving as a subtle but powerful influence on the conceptualization of the universe. Quote 29. Indeed, it seems that long before human consciousness forms its first fixed concepts concerning the basic objective differentiations of number, time, and space, a consciousness of the subtlest sensitivity to the peculiar periodicity and rhythm prevails in human life. This quote acknowledges that even before the structured understanding of time, space, and number, humans possess an innate sensitivity to the rhythms and cycles of life. This fundamental awareness shapes cultural practices, religious beliefs, and the daily life of various communities, demonstrating the deep-rooted human connection to the natural world's rhythms. Quote 30. Even at the lowest stages of culture, even among natural peoples who have barely arrived at the first beginnings of enumeration, and who consequently cannot possibly have any exact quantitative apprehension of temporal relationships, we often find this subjective feeling for the living dynamic of the temporal events, developed in astonishing subtlety and precision. This statement highlights the remarkable intuitive grasp of time that exists even among cultures that have not developed a formal system of counting or time measurement. Despite the absence of quantitative methods, these societies possess a sophisticated understanding of time's flow through life's phases and significant events, which is often reflected in their rituals and cultural practices. Quote 31. To a certain extent, a unique mythical religious feeling of phases connects them to all the occurrences of life, particularly to all the most important periods, all the crucial transformations and transitions. The quote points out that, in many cultures, a distinct sensitivity to life's significant phases, like birth, death, and transitions, plays a central role in shaping religious and cultural practices. This connection underscores the profound impact that the perception of time has on human spirituality and societal structures, linking the rhythm of life events to the sacred. Quote 32. Even at the lowest levels, these transitions, the most important turning points, Einschnitt, in the life of the species, as well as in the life of the individual, are in some way distinguished by the cult, are somehow lifted out of the uniform course of events. This explanation illustrates how critical life transitions are ritually and culturally marked to signify their importance, distinguishing them from the regular flow of daily life. Such practices highlight the human need to recognize and ceremonially honor life's significant changes, embedding these moments with spiritual and communal significance. Quote 33. The final act in the great world drama, in the end of times, in which the spirit of light will have conquered the spirit of darkness. For redemption is accomplished not only through God, but also through humans, and with the help of humans. This quote highlights a recurring theme in mythology across various cultures, portraying a cosmological battle between light and darkness, where the eventual triumph of light symbolizes the culmination of a metaphysical struggle. This narrative underscores the mythic belief in a moral and cosmic order where human participation is crucial, reflecting a worldview where human actions are integrally tied to universal outcomes. Quote 34. If we compare this basic view to the image of time and becoming as it emerges in the philosophical and religious speculation of India, the contrast is immediately discernible. Here, the quote sets the stage for a comparison between different cultural interpretations of time, particularly contrasting the mythological views of time in Iranian and Indian contexts. It introduces a discourse on how different civilizations conceptualize metaphysical and existential questions, each shaping their spiritual and philosophical outlooks in distinct ways, rooted in their unique historical and cultural matrices. Quote 35. Once the first natural form of the early Vedic religions was overcome, religion more and more assumed the color of thought. This statement reflects on the evolution of religious thought in India, noting a transition from early ritualistic practices to a more reflective and contemplative religious philosophy. It indicates a deepening of religious experience from mere ceremonial adherence to an engagement with abstract philosophical ideas, illustrating the dynamic nature of religious evolution, where intuitive practices give way to intellectual explorations of the divine. Quote 36. The source of suffering is the threefold thirst: the thirst for pleasure, the thirst for becoming, and the thirst for transitoriness. This profound observation encapsulates a central tenet of Buddhist philosophy, which identifies desire or thirst as the root cause of human suffering. It succinctly captures the Buddhist critique of existential conditions, pointing to a fundamental aspect of human nature that perpetuates suffering through incessant craving and attachment to impermanent states and things. Quote 37. For Heraclitus, the intuition of harmony of opposing tensions solves the riddle of form and takes from us the burden of becoming. Heraclitus's philosophy suggested that the underlying order of the universe is a balance between opposing forces, which he described as a harmony of tensions. This view portrays existence not as a burden, but as a dynamic interplay of contrasts that form a cohesive whole. By embracing this flux and seeing the beauty in these tensions, Heraclitus offers a way to appreciate the complexity of life without being overwhelmed by its perpetual change. This harmony within the flux provides a profound insight into the nature of reality, suggesting that true understanding comes from recognizing and accepting the inherent contradictions in existence. Quote 38. Picus, I will teach you the burden, the taking up aufheben of the burden, and laying down of the burden. And what, Picus, is the burden? It should be said, the 5 aggregates subject to clinging. What 5? That the form aggregate subject clinging, the feeling aggregate subject to clinging, the perception aggregate subject to clinging, the volitional formations aggregate subject to clinging, the consciousness aggregate subject to clinging. This is called the burden. Friends, form is impermanent. What is impermanent is suffering. What is suffering has ceased and passed away. What is impermanent is suffering. What is suffering has ceased and passed away. This quote embodies the core of Buddhist philosophy, where the Buddha teaches that the five aggregates, form, feeling, perception, volitional formations, and consciousness, are inherently tied to suffering due to their transient nature. Understanding and internalizing the impermanence of these aggregates is seen as essential for spiritual liberation, framing existence itself as a burden that one must learn to put down through the path of enlightenment. Quote 39. No one stressed the changeability of what the common view calls the form of things more sharply than Heraclitus. However, he draws from it the exact opposite consequence to the one drawn in Buddha's sermon. It leads him not to a rejection of existence, but rather to its passionate affirmation. This passage highlights Heraclitus's philosophy of constant flux, presenting it as a stark contrast to Buddhist teachings. While Buddha views impermanence as a source of suffering that should lead to detachment from worldly things, Heraclitus embraces the ever-changing nature of existence as the very essence of life. His philosophy encourages a deep engagement with the world, perceiving constant change as a dynamic aspect of existence that should be celebrated, not shunned. Quote 40. It would not be possible to speak of a discovery of subjective reality in myth if the generally held view that the I concept and soul concept formed the beginning of all mythical thinking were justified. This quote challenges the traditional view that myths primarily originate from early concepts of self or soul, suggesting instead that these concepts are not the origin, but rather a development within mythological thinking. It emphasizes that understanding mythical consciousness requires recognizing that the notions of self and soul are outcomes of mythical narratives, not their starting points. Quote 41. For a glance at the development of each individual symbolic form shows us everywhere that their essential achievement does not consist in the fact that they reproduce the outward world in the inward world, or that they simply project a finished inner world outward, but rather that the two elements of inside and outside, of I and reality, first receive their determination and their mutual demarcation in and through their mediation. This statement explores the dynamic interplay between internal and external realities in the formation of symbolic forms, including myths. It asserts that these forms do not merely reflect or project pre-existing realities, but actively shape and define the boundaries between subjective, internal, and objective external realms. This interaction is foundational to the creation of meaning and understanding in human perception and culture. Quote 42. Indeed, the phenomenology of mythical consciousness provides thoroughgoing confirmation of this systematic assumption. The further we extend the framework, Ramen, of this phenomenology, and the deeper we penetrate its basic and originary strata, the clearer it becomes that for myth, the concept of the soul is no finished and fixed pattern, shablon, into which it arranges everything that comes into its grasp, but rather that for myth, the concept of the soul signifies an element that is fluid and malleable, versatile and open to configuration, that changes, as it were, in its hands as it makes use of it. This passage underscores the fluidity and adaptability of the concept of the soul within mythical consciousness. Unlike the rigid, static view often ascribed to metaphysical or rational psychology, in mythology, the soul is not a predefined entity, but a flexible and evolving concept that adapts and transforms within different narratives and cultural contexts. This flexibility allows the soul to serve various symbolic and functional purposes within myths, reflecting the dynamic nature of mythological thought itself. Quote 43. Thus, in the Roman belief of the soul, the lares are distinguished from the larvae. The latter are wandering phantoms that spread terror and evil, whereas the former are friendly spirits that bear a certain individual character, japrej, that are bound up with an individual person or individual place, to the house or the field, and that protect it from harmful influences. This quote reflects the Roman understanding of guardian spirits, distinguishing between lares and larvae, where lares are protective and connected to specific places or people, embodying a form of benevolent presence that safeguards the household or fields. This conceptualization highlights the integration of spiritual beliefs with daily life and physical spaces, marking a significant cultural perception of protective and malevolent spiritual forces within the Roman mythos. Quote 44. The representation of such personal guardian spirits seems to recur in the mythology of almost all peoples. It has been found in the religions of the Greeks and Romans, in Native American religions, as well as among the religions of the Finns and the Old Celts. This statement indicates the widespread and cross-cultural presence of the concept of guardian spirits in various mythologies around the world. This recurring motif underscores a universal human inclination to believe in spiritual entities that watch over individuals or communities, suggesting a deep-seated psychological and cultural mechanism for coping with the uncertainties of life and the environment. Quote 45. Thus, the Batak's view of the soul is grounded, for example, in the idea that a person before their birth, before their sensible lived corporeal existence, is chosen by their soul, their tondi, and that everything that concerns the person, all their fortune or misfortune, depends on this choice. This quote describes the Batak belief in predestination by a personal soul or spirit, known as tondi, which selects a person before their birth, shaping their entire life's trajectory. This belief system attributes a significant level of agency and determinism to the soul, which not only accompanies but actively influences an individual's life, embodying a unique synthesis of fate and personal spiritual essence within their cultural worldview. Quote 46. For here again, the individual feeling of self and individual self-consciousness stand not at the beginning but at the end of the development. This statement points out that individual self-awareness is not the starting point, but the culmination of a developmental process within mythical consciousness. It implies that the self is shaped through a series of communal and cultural interactions that gradually distinguish the individual from the collective, suggesting a dynamic evolution of personal identity rooted deeply in social and mythological structures. Quote 47. The opposition between subject and object, the differentiation of the I from all tangible givenness and determinacy, is not the only form in which progress is made from a general, still undifferentiated life feeling to the concept and consciousness of the self. This quote suggests that the formation of the self-concept within mythology does not only emerge through the division of subject and object, but also through a deeper inherent differentiation that occurs within the self. It highlights that the development of self-awareness is a multifaceted process that transcends simple cognitive distinctions, involving more profound aspects of personal and communal identity. Quote 48. Even an examination of the mere contents of mythical consciousness indicates that these contents are in no way exclusively or even predominantly derived from the sphere of an immediate intuition of nature. This quote emphasizes that the elements found within mythical consciousness are not solely based on direct observations of nature, but also involve complex interpretations and the infusion of cultural and social values. It challenges the notion that myths are merely descriptive of natural phenomena, presenting them instead as rich, interpretative constructs that reflect deeper human concerns and societal structures. Quote 49. For every action and state, special gods are created and named with clear word coinage. And it is not merely actions and states as a whole that are deified in this way, but also any segments, acts, or moments of them that are in any way conspicuous. This quote emphasizes the detailed nature of mythological consciousness in attributing specific divine entities to various actions and states within human activities. It illustrates how deeply ingrained and segmented the mythical understanding of the world is, where not just broad concepts, but even minute aspects of daily tasks are overseen by specialized deities. This multiplicity of gods reflects a worldview where every facet of existence is imbued with spiritual significance and supervised by a divine force, illustrating a complex interaction between the human and the divine. Quote 50. Consciousness arrives at a clear separation of the individual spheres of activity, as well as the divergent objective and subjective conditions, only by referring each of these spheres to a fixed center, to one determinate mythical figure. This statement reveals how mythical consciousness achieves clarity and organization of its world through the centralization of activities and phenomena around specific mythical figures or gods. Each sphere of human activity is not just an independent domain, but is intimately connected to a divine counterpart that embodies and influences that domain. This arrangement provides a structured way to understand and interact with the world, where every action and its outcome are seen as part of a divine narrative or under the control of a specific deity, reinforcing the mythological structure of understanding and the spiritualization of everyday life. Quote 51. The invocation of a particular god as a guardian or helper presiding over each singular activity would certainly appear to leave unrecognized the spontaneity of doing. All doing as such seems to be regarded as a mere manifestation of the same God, hence as something coming from without rather than from within. This quote discusses the implications of mythical consciousness, where every human action is considered a manifestation of divine will, suggesting that individual spontaneity and agency are often overshadowed by the divine attributes assigned to every act. This perspective indicates a worldview where human actions are not entirely of their own making, but are influenced or directed by divine entities, attributing a theistic essence to the causality and outcomes of human endeavors. This diminishes the role of personal agency and spontaneity by framing actions as the unfolding of divine intervention or will. Quote 52. For in the moment, Augenblick, in which the human seeks to exert an influence on things not by mere image or name magic, but through tools, even though initially this influence, Einwirkung itself, operates through the customary channels of magic. It undergoes a spiritual separation, an inner crisis. The omnipotence of mere desire is broken. Doing is now subject to certain objective conditions from which it cannot deviate. This quote highlights a pivotal shift in mythical consciousness as humans transition from relying purely on magical or symbolic means to employing tools to influence their environment. This transition marks a significant psychological and spiritual development, where human actions become constrained by the limitations and requirements of physical tools. This not only alters the human relationship with the world, emphasizing a more pragmatic and less mystical engagement, but also represents a deeper transformation within the self-conception of human agency, moving from an unrestricted magical omnipotence to a recognition of the practical and often challenging realities of interacting with the physical world. Quote 53. For humans, the outward world first acquires its determinate existence and its determinate organization in the separation of these conditions, since for the human, nothing belongs to the world that has not in some way been touched by its will and its doing. This statement delves into how human perception of the external world becomes more defined and organized through the use of tools and the execution of deliberate actions. By engaging with the world through specific, goal-oriented tasks, humans come to understand and categorize their environment in ways that reflect their interactions and interventions. This process not only shapes human understanding of the world, but also reinforces the sense of a distinct self or identity that acts upon and thereby knows the world, underscoring a fundamental aspect of human cognition and cultural development. Quote 54. It separates off a fixed circle of objects that are designated precisely by the fact that they have a distinctive, consistent existence by which they oppose, entgegenstehen, immediate longing and desire. In this quote, the emergence of object permanence and distinctiveness is linked to human tool use and labor. As humans engage with the world through tools, they begin to recognize objects as separate entities with inherent properties, opposing and resisting mere human desire. This recognition marks a cognitive evolution from seeing the world as an extension of human will to understanding it as composed of independent objects with their own characteristics and resistances. This shift plays a critical role in the development of logical and scientific thinking, moving away from a mythologically integrated worldview to one where objects are understood in their own right, laying the groundwork for objective analysis and empirical science. Quote 55. The reciprocal relation between the human and God that establishes itself in the progress of mythical and religious consciousness has thus far been regarded essentially in the form in which it presents itself in the mythical religious representational world. This quote introduces the concept of a reciprocal relationship between humans and gods as understood within mythical and religious contexts. This relationship is not static, but evolves as religious and mythical consciousness progresses. It highlights the dynamic interaction where both human understanding and the depiction of the divine are continually reshaped by cultural, spiritual, and societal changes, reflecting deeper integrations and shifts within the belief systems themselves. Quote 56. Modern empirical research into myth has, in that it has exposed this interconnection in a great number of individual cases, only provided the confirmation of a thought that was first formulated in speculative universality in Hegel's philosophy of religion. This statement acknowledges the alignment between contemporary empirical research into myth and the philosophical insights of Hegel concerning the role of cult and ritual in religious practice. It suggests that modern studies have empirically substantiated Hegel's earlier speculative ideas about the fundamental importance of cult activities in forming and expressing religious consciousness. This affirmation underscores the validity and enduring relevance of philosophical interpretations of religious practices, bridging historical, speculative thought with contemporary empirical research. Quote 57. For Hegel, the cult and the particular forms of the cult are always the central point for the interpretation of the religious process. Here, the focus is on Hegel's view that the essence of religion is most vividly and authentically expressed through its cultic practices. Hegel posits that these practices are not merely ceremonial, but are central to understanding the nature of religious experience. This approach positions the rituals and ceremonies of religion as fundamental to deciphering the progression and substance of religious thought and consciousness, emphasizing the importance of the performative and communal aspects of religious engagement over doctrinal or theological abstractions. Quote 58. It is not enough to speak here of mere analogy. Rather, in accordance with the basic feature of mythical thinking, this analogy shifts everywhere into an actual identity. This statement delves deeper into the mechanism of mythical thought, where analogies between the human and the divine do not remain mere comparisons but transform into perceived identities. This shift from analogy to identity underscores the profound integration of the spiritual and the mundane within mythical consciousness, where metaphysical concepts are directly mapped onto physical realities, creating a lived experience of the divine in everyday life. Quote 59. The most elementary form in which the opposition between the God and the human and the overcoming of this opposition can be apprehended is one in which both the separation as well as the restoration of community are understood analogously as basic physical relationships. This quote underscores the fundamental nature of the relationship between humans and gods in mythological contexts. This relationship is articulated through physical metaphors that symbolically describe the separation from and reconnection with the divine. This not only illustrates how deeply entwined physical and spiritual conceptions are in mythical thought, but also highlights the processes through which these relationships are mediated and understood. Quote 60. What originally combines the human with the god is a real bond of the community of blood. This quote highlights the concept of a blood bond between humans and gods, a common motif in various mythologies that emphasizes a literal familial relationship with the divine. This belief in a blood connection serves as a foundational element in the mythological worldview, establishing a direct lineage and a profound sense of belonging and identity shared between humans and their gods. Quote 61. In our considerations of language, we endeavored to show how the word and the linguistic sound, before realizing their purely symbolic function, pass through a series of intermediary stages in which they hover as it were, between the world of things and the world of significations. This quote explores the transition of language from its mimetic origins to its symbolic functions, suggesting that words and sounds initially serve as a bridge between tangible objects and abstract meanings. This intermediary stage is crucial, as it highlights the evolution of language from simply mirroring the physical world to conveying broader, more complex concepts. Quote 62. Even religious expression, in the shape in which it first emerges, is characterized by this immediate proximity to sensible existence. Here, the focus is on the primal forms of religious expression which are deeply rooted in the sensory experiences of the physical world. This proximity emphasizes how early religious expressions are intertwined with the tangible aspects of existence, indicating that spiritual understanding initially depends heavily on the material world. Quote 63. It would not be able to occur in being and endure in being if it did not in this way hold on to the sensible tangible with clutching organs. This statement further underscores the necessity for religious expressions to grip the physical, sensible world in order to manifest and sustain themselves. The imagery of clutching organs vividly conveys how religious ideas must embed themselves within the tangible aspects of the world to maintain relevance and presence. Quote 64. Of course, there is no manifestation of religious spirit, however primitive, in which, as in the speech sound, we do not recognize a tendency toward separation, toward the crisis to come that will take place in it. The quote suggests that even in the most foundational forms of religious expression, there is an inherent drive towards distinguishing the spiritual from the tangible. This drive foretells a coming crisis, a point of critical separation, where the spiritual must distinguish itself from the physical, reflecting a deep-seated evolutionary trajectory in religious thought. Quote 65. For even in the most elementary formations of the religious, a separation is always made between the world of the sacred and that of the profane. This quote reveals a fundamental aspect of religious thought, the division between the sacred and the profane. It implies that from its inception, religious consciousness is structured around this dichotomy, shaping how the spiritual world is perceived in contrast to everyday, mundane reality. This separation not only categorizes different aspects of existence, but also enhances the significance of religious practices by setting them apart from ordinary life. The Philosophy of Symbolic Forms, Volume 2, Mythical Thought, by Ernst Cassirer, reveals myth as an essential part of human culture that shapes our perception and understanding of the world. Throughout the book, Cassirer highlights the symbolic structures underlying mythical thought and how these structures inform human experience by bridging subjective consciousness and external reality. He underscores the importance of mythical thinking as not merely a precursor to rational thought, but as an ongoing, valuable force in the construction of human culture, continuously interacting with language, art, and religion to enrich and shape the collective human experience.
Curious to dive into the mind of Ernst Cassirer? With StudyLab Pro's book GPT, it's possible. Ask questions, explore themes, and discover the depths of The Philosophy of Symbolic Forms, Volume 2, Mythical Thought, in an entirely new way. Start your conversation now by clicking on our logo, and if you're hungry for more educational content, subscribe to our channel to keep discovering, learning, and growing. Want more than just videos? Click on our logo now to join us on our platform for multiple choice tests, in-depth content, and tools to help you ace your studies. Get started now.